12 hours before the wedding of the century. I walked into my fiancé's office hoping to surprise him, but found a torn courier envelope on his desk instead. Inside was not $1 million contract, but a baby shower invitation for him and his assistant, paid for with my wedding funds. That mistake signed the death warrant for our 5-year romance and launched a brutal revenge plan right at the altar. My name is Elena Vance. At 28 years old, I believed I was walking toward the happiest day of my life. But instead, I was walking into a crime scene where the victim was my own future. It was 11 o'clock at night when I arrived at the headquarters of Sterling Global. The skyscraper was a monolith of glass and steel, silent and imposing against the dark city skyline. I had told myself I was there to be romantic, to drop off the wedding bands Julian had absent-mindedly left at the jeweler, but the oppressive quiet of the empty executive floor made the velvet box in my hand feel heavy, like a stone. The only sound was the rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor, echoing like a countdown I did not know had started. I reached the double glass doors of the CEO's office. The lights were blazing, cutting through the gloom of the hallway, but the chair behind the massive mahogany desk was empty. I stepped inside, frowning slightly at the disarray. Julian was usually fastidious, yet his workspace was littered with financial reports and legal briefs. Amidst the chaotic sea of white paper and black ink, a single object stood out. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind that whispered of old money and exclusivity. The handwriting on the front was elegant and looping, reading simply, "To Julian Sterling, private." A strange, cold prickle danced down my spine. Curiosity, sharp and undeniable, forced my hand to reach out. I slid the heavy cardstock out of the envelope. The design was exquisite, featuring watercolor illustrations of 2 pairs of tiny baby feet. The text was embossed in gold leaf. "Join us to welcome the twins of Julian and Mia." My breath hitched in my throat, a physical blockage that made my chest ache. Mia. My brain struggled to process the name. Mia was his executive assistant. She was the woman I had lunched with every Tuesday for 2 years. She was the one who had helped me select the floral arrangements for tomorrow, the one I had trusted with every intimate detail of the wedding planning because I viewed her as a sister. My eyes darted to the date printed at the bottom. The party was scheduled for exactly 1 week from today. I stared at the calligraphy, my mind racing. Next week. Julian and I were supposed to be on a private island in the Maldives for our honeymoon. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The late nights at the office. The sudden, urgent business trips that lasted exactly 24 hours. They had not been for mergers or acquisitions. They had been for ultrasounds and prenatal checkups. Just as I was about to crumble, a sound froze me in place. It came from the private relaxation suite attached to the main office, a room equipped with a shower and a daybed for those grueling 18-hour workdays. The heavy oak door was cracked open just an inch. I heard Julian's voice, rich and smooth, the same voice that had whispered vows to me during our rehearsal dinner only 4 hours ago. Then came the laughter. It was Mia, giggling in a way that sounded obscene in the quiet office. "I cannot believe she actually paid for the entire nursery renovation," Mia said, her voice muffled but distinct. "The custom cribs alone cost $10,000. Julian laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Elena is the perfect prey, babe. She is so desperate to be the perfect wife. She throws money at problems before they even exist. Once the merger is finalized and her father signs over the voting rights, we will move into the estate. She can have the condo." Bile rose in my throat, burning and acidic. The room spun, but I dug my fingernails into my palm until the sharp pain grounded me. I did not scream. I did not kick open the door and demand answers. Instead, a terrifying calm washed over me, cold and absolute. My hands, which had been shaking moments ago, became steady. I pulled out my phone. I took 3 high-resolution photos of the invitation, capturing the names and the dates clearly. Then, I crept toward the door of the private suite, holding my breath, and pressed the record button. I captured 45 seconds of their conversation, enough to ruin them both. When I was done, I slipped the invitation back into the envelope and placed it exactly where I had found it, at the precise angle, as if it had never been touched. I turned and walked out of the office. I moved like a ghost, leaving no trace of my presence. The elevator ride down took less than a minute, but in that short time, the woman who loved Julian Sterling died. When the doors opened to the lobby, only Elena Vance remained, and her heart was no longer beating for love, but for total, scorched earth destruction. I returned to our shared penthouse, and the silence there was different from the silence in the office. It was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of the lie I had been living. A normal woman might have collapsed on the floor or thrown the expensive vases against the wall, but I did not shed a single tear. The switch in my brain that controlled my emotions had been flipped off, leaving only a cold, mechanical drive for truth. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the study and opened my laptop. Julian, in his supreme arrogance, had once logged into his primary financial dashboard on my device and selected the Remember Password option. He assumed I was too technologically illiterate or too trusting to ever look. That was his second mistake of the night. I navigated through the layers of security with the ease of someone who already knew the answers to the security questions. I went straight to the account labeled Wedding Fund. My father had deposited a significant sum there to cover the venue and catering, a figure totaling over $500,000. I watched the screen refresh, and the numbers told a sickening story. The account was nearly empty. The money had not gone to the florists or the caterers. It had been funneled through a shell company into a real estate purchase. I pulled up the deed. It was a 5-bedroom villa in the suburbs, purchased 2 months ago. The owner of record was Mia Davis. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the rest of the expenses. The item listed as honeymoon in Maldives was a fabrication. The transaction reference numbers linked to an airline invoice for 2 first-class tickets to Zurich, departing 2 days after the wedding, with a return date 3 months later. He was sending her away to give birth in privacy while I sat at home wondering where my husband was. I dug deeper, accessing his archived emails. I found a thread with his personal lawyer titled Post-Nuptial Strategy. I opened the attachment and read the legal jargon that outlined a hostile takeover of my family's company. The plan was explicit. Once we were married, Julian intended to use spousal leverage to claim voting rights on my shares. It was not just theft, it was a coup. Then I found the correspondence with Mia. It was far worse than a sexual affair. She was his strategist. In an email dated 6 months ago, she had instructed him to tell me that my college friends were jealous of my success, effectively isolating me from my support system. She had even scripted the arguments he used to make me feel guilty for working late. I needed physical confirmation to seal the digital evidence. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of the private investigator my father had used for corporate vetting for 30 years. It was 2 a.m, but he answered on the first ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sent him the address of the suburban villa and the digital packet I had just compiled. I told him I needed eyes on the ground immediately. 20 minutes later, my phone pinged. The investigator had tapped into the villa's perimeter security cameras. He sent me a stream of images time-stamped from last week. They were high-definition shots. Julian was there, standing on the patio. Mia was with him, wearing a sheer nightgown, her hands resting on a baby bump that was unmistakably around 5 months along. They were kissing, relaxed and domestic, in a house paid for with my father's money. I opened a new presentation file. I began to assemble the narrative, dragging and dropping the bank statements, the emails, the ultrasound dates, the photos of the villa, and the audio recording from the office. I synchronized the timestamps to show exactly where he was when he claimed to be in board meetings. It was a masterclass in deception. And now, it was a weapon. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Julian did not love me. He did not even like me. He needed the Vance family name to cover up the massive debt holes in Sterling Global's balance sheet. I was a financial bailout wearing silk and diamonds. I stood up and walked to the center of the room where my custom couture wedding dress hung on a mannequin. It was a masterpiece of lace and silk, costing more than most people earned in a year. I ran my hand over the fabric. I could call my father now. I could cancel the wedding. I could issue a press release. But that would be too easy. That would allow them to hide in the shadows. I looked at the dress and made a decision that terrified and thrilled me. There would be no cancellation. The wedding would proceed exactly as planned. I would walk down that aisle, and I would turn the most exclusive social event of the season into a public execution of their reputation. The morning of my wedding arrived with a cruel brilliance. Sunlight flooded the penthouse suite, mocking the darkness that had settled in my soul overnight. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Julian. It read, "Good morning, beautiful. Can't wait to make you Mrs. Sterling today. I love you more than life itself." The words, which only yesterday would have made my heart flutter, now looked like venom dripping on the screen. He was playing his role to the very end, assuming I was still the naive heiress he could manipulate with a few cheap sentiments and a charming smile. The doorbell rang, and Mia swept in, a whirlwind of organized chaos and feigned excitement. As my maid of honor, she was technically in charge of my happiness today. She hugged me, her perfume cloying and sweet, and I felt the rigid tension in her frame. "You look tired, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with a concern that did not reach her eyes. "Did you get cold feet?" There was a flicker of triumph in her gaze, a subtle challenge hidden beneath the layers of friendship. I smiled back, a mask of porcelain perfection. "Not at all," I replied smoothly. "Just excitement. Thank you for handling everything. Mia, I really do not know what I would do without you." She helped me into my dress, her hands lingering on the silk a little too long, perhaps imagining herself in it. As she fastened the pearl buttons down my back, I decided to test the waters. "Julian and I were talking about starting a family immediately," I said casually, watching her reflection in the vanity mirror. "He really wants twins." I saw her hands freeze. A spasm of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "That is wonderful," she stammered, her voice tight. I did not realize he was ready for children. I hummed a happy little tune, enjoying the fear radiating off her. "Oh yes, he is obsessed with the idea." Looking at her now, pieces of the past snapped into focus. I remembered the afternoon she sat me down over coffee, looking grave and serious, urging me to sign the prenuptial agreement Julian's lawyers had drafted. She had told me it was the only way to prove to the board that I loved Julian for himself, not his business potential. I had thought she was looking out for my romantic interests. Now I knew she was just clearing the path for them to strip me clean without legal repercussions. A knock on the door broke the tension. My father walked in, looking distinguished in his tuxedo. When he saw me, his eyes misted over. "You look exactly like your mother," he whispered. He had no idea that the man he was about to hand me off to was a viper he had welcomed into our garden. A wave of guilt washed over me. I was about to shatter his illusion of a perfect day, but I reminded myself that temporary pain was better than permanent ruin. I was not just saving myself today, I was saving his legacy. While my father turned to speak to the photographer, I grabbed my phone one last time. I opened a secure messaging app and typed a single line to the head of the audiovisual team at the venue. "Are we locked and loaded?" The reply came back instantly. "All systems go. Ms. Vance." I had transferred $50,000 to his personal account at 3 a.m. to ensure his loyalty shifted from the groom to the bride. A courier arrived with a black velvet box. "A gift from the groom," Mia announced, her voice tight with jealousy she could not quite suppress. I opened it to reveal a diamond choker, glittering cold and hard under the chandelier lights. I recognized the design. I had seen the invoice for this exact piece in the stolen files last night, paid for with funds embezzled from my own charitable foundation. He was buying my forgiveness with my own money. I lifted the necklace and clasped it around my throat. It felt like a collar, but today it would serve as armor. I looked into the mirror, staring into my own eyes. The soft, loving Elena was gone. The woman staring back was sharp, cold, and ready for war. I would make them pay for every lie, every stolen dollar, and every moment they thought they had outsmarted me. Grand Oak Manor was a spectacle of excess, transformed into a fairy tale that cost more than the GDP of a small island nation. The sprawling lawn was manicured to within an inch of its life, dotted with white silk pavilions and crystal chandeliers suspended from 100-year-old oak trees. 500 guests filled the venue, a veritable who is who of the city elite. Senators rubbed elbows with tech moguls, and socialites judged each other's outfits over glasses of vintage champagne. The air buzzed with the polite, hollow laughter of people who were there to be seen, not to celebrate love. At the end of the aisle, under an archway of 10,000 imported white roses, stood Julian. He looked the part of the golden boy perfectly. His tuxedo was bespoke, tailoring his ambition into a sleek silhouette. He was working the crowd even from the altar, flashing his charismatic smile at potential investors, shaking hands with firm confidence. To everyone else, he was a man in love waiting for his bride. To me, he was a shark circling the water, already counting the money he would steal once I said I do. Mia was flitting about the periphery, playing the role of the devoted maid of honor with suspicious intensity. She barked orders at the catering staff and rearranged floral centerpieces, acting more like the mistress of the manor than a member of the bridal party. Every time she passed near Julian, their eyes would meet for a fraction of a second, a secret, burning glance that screamed of their intimacy. It was nauseating to watch. Then there was Julian's mother, Beatrice Sterling. She sat in the front row, rigid and regal in emerald silk, looking down her nose at everyone. I knew she was aware of the affair. I had seen the text messages on Julian's phone backup. She approved of Mia because Mia was carrying the sterling heir, while I was merely the bank account needed to keep their crumbling empire afloat. Her complicity made my blood run cold. The vintage Rolls-Royce pulled up to the start of the aisle, and a hush fell over the crowd. As I stepped out, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. I knew I looked perfect. My dress was a cloud of lace, my makeup flawless, but beneath the veil, my expression was carved from ice. I saw Julian's shoulders visibly relax when he saw me. He let out a breath he had been holding. He had been terrified I would figure it out. He thought my presence here meant he had won, that the Vance fortune was finally, securely within his grasp. I took my father's arm. His grip was warm and reassuring, the only real thing in this entire charade. We began to walk. The music swelled, a haunting orchestral piece that sounded more like a funeral march to my ears, step by step. I moved closer to the man who had murdered my trust. 10 steps, 5 steps. Each footfall was a ticking second on a bomb timer. As I passed Mia, I paused for just a heartbeat. I turned my head and gave her a small, enigmatic smile, the kind of smile a predator gives before it strikes. I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, followed by a sudden, inexplicable shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself as if a cold wind had just blown through the summer garden. I reached the altar and my father kissed my cheek, handing me over to Julian. The music faded to a respectful silence. The world narrowed down to just the two of us. Julian took my hands in his. His palms were warm, his grip possessive. He looked into my eyes with a gaze that simulated adoration so well it was terrifying. But I looked deeper, behind the blue irises. I saw the greed. I saw the calculation. I saw a man looking at a winning lottery ticket, not a wife. The air between us crackled not with chemistry, but with the impending storm. The play was set, the actors were in position. and it was time for the final act. The minister cleared his throat, a sound that reverberated through the silent garden, signaling the beginning of the end. He turned to Julian first. My fiancé took a deep breath, looking every bit the devoted partner, and began to recite the vows we had practiced. He spoke of honesty, of a love that would weather any storm, and of a fidelity that would remain unbroken until death parted us. His voice was steady and rich, projecting to the back rows where the senators and CEOs sat. It was a masterful performance, worthy of an Academy Award. He looked me in the eye as he promised to cherish me above all others, and for a fleeting second, I almost admired his capacity for deceit. He did not stutter. He did not blink. He lied to my face and to God with the same casual ease that he signed false expense reports. Then, the silence fell on me. It was my turn. The minister nodded encouragingly, waiting for me to recite the standard promises about obedience and support. I looked down at the small white card in my hand, the one with the prepared speech about how Julian was my soulmate. I let the card slip from my fingers. It fluttered to the ground, landing softly on the white carpet. I did not prepare a traditional vow, I said, my voice clear and amplified by the microphone, cutting through the humid air. Instead, I want to tell a story, a fable, if you will, about the nature of trust and the price of betrayal. A murmur of confusion rippled through the seated guests. I saw my father lean forward, his brow furrowed in concern. Julian's smile became fixed, a rigid rictus of polite confusion. He squeezed my hand, a silent warning to stick to the script, but I did not pull away. Not yet. True love, I continued, staring deep into Julian's eyes, is about sharing. It is about sharing your life, your fortune, and your secrets. It is about knowing that when your partner says they are working late, they are not actually building a secret life in a suburban villa bought with stolen funds. It is about knowing that the family you are building is just us, and not a set of secret twins waiting to be born. Julian's face lost its color. His eyes darted to the side, panic flaring behind the blue contact lenses. He still thought I was speaking in metaphors, that perhaps I was making a strange, ill-timed joke about our future. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mia. She was standing just 3 feet away. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax figure. She gripped her bouquet of lilies so hard the stems snapped. She knew. She understood exactly what I was saying. I stopped speaking. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a tornado touches down. I slowly turned my head away from Julian and locked eyes with my maid of honor. "Thank you, Mia," I said, my voice dropping to a chill whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "Thank you for planning this beautiful wedding. And thank you for taking such good care of my husband's small, secret family." The gasp from the audience was audible, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the garden. Julian's smile vanished instantly. His hands, which had been holding mine, turned clammy. He realized then that the ground had shifted beneath him. "Elena," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. He tried to pull me closer, attempting to play the role of the concerned husband soothing a hysterical wife. "Honey, you are emotional. The stress of the day is getting to you. Please, let us take a moment." I looked at his hand on my arm, looking at it as if it were a poisonous spider, violently. I ripped my arm away from his grasp. The force of the movement made him stumble back a step. "I am not emotional, Julian," I declared, my voice ringing out like a judgment from high. "I have never been more awake in my life. I am just here to give you the wedding gift you truly deserve." I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. In an instant, the thousands of fairy lights strung in the trees went black. The spotlights on the altar died. The garden was plunged into sudden, disorienting gloom. The only light remaining came from the massive LED screen erected behind the bandstand, which flickered to life with a blinding white glare, ready to illuminate the darkness with the ugly, naked truth. The 500-inch LED screen behind the altar, intended to display a montage of our romantic journey, flickered to life with blinding intensity. It did not show photos of our first date or our engagement party. Instead, a colossal image of the pastel baby shower invitation filled the frame. The names Julian and Mia were projected 10 feet high, impossible to miss, looming over the guests like a neon judgment. The silence in the garden shattered instantly. It started with a gasp that sucked the air out of the venue, followed immediately by a roar of disbelief. It was the sound of hundreds of people realizing they were witnessing a social massacre. Almost in unison, the guests reacted. The veneer of politeness evaporated. Phones that had been tucked away in clutches and pockets were whipped out. The press photographers, who had been relegated to a designated pen at the back, broke protocol and rushed forward, their shutters clicking like machine gun fire. They were not capturing a wedding anymore. They were documenting a scandal that would dominate the headlines for months. Live streams started broadcasting the humiliation to the world in real time. The screen refreshed, the slide changing with a cheerful digital chime that sounded grotesque in the tense atmosphere. The invitation was replaced by the surveillance photos from the suburbs. There was Julian standing on the patio of the villa, his hand resting possessively on Mia's lower back. There was Mia, kissing him, looking radiant and pregnant. Then came the medical records. A scan of a 20-week ultrasound appeared, the black and white ghostly image of twins clearly visible. In the top corner, highlighted in bright red digital marker, were the parents' names Julian Sterling and Mia Davis. Julian reacted with the frantic energy of a drowning man. He abandoned all pretense of dignity and sprinted toward the technical booth situated to the left of the stage. "Turn it off," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Kill the feed right now." He threw himself against the door of the control room, pounding on it with his fists, but the door remained unyielding. The technicians inside, loyal to the $50,000 I had wired them, had locked it from the inside and were likely enjoying the show. Julian was helpless, flailing against a steel door while his life burned down behind him. I glanced at Mia. She had not moved. She stood frozen near the floral arch, her face draining of all blood until she looked like a corpse. Her hands flew to her stomach instinctively, a gesture of protection that damned her further in the eyes of the crowd. She looked out at the sea of phones pointed at her, her eyes wide with terror. The presentation on the screen continued its merciless march. The photos vanished, replaced by rows of Excel spreadsheets and bank statements. The text was crisp and legible. I had highlighted specific transactions in crimson. The audience could clearly see the transfers from the Vance Family Trust labeled for wedding vendors being rerouted directly into an offshore account under Mia's name. Then came the emails. I had saved the best for last. A chain of correspondence between Julian and his lawyer appeared. The words were magnified for everyone to read. "The Vances are just rich idiots," Julian had written. "Once the marriage license is signed, we will have the voting rights. I give it 6 months before we can push Elena out and take full control." In the front row, my father stood up. The movement was abrupt and violent, knocking his chair backward. His face was a mask of fury, his hands trembling not with age but with the urge to strangle. He raised a single hand, and 4 men in dark suits, our private security detail, stepped out from the shadows of the pergola, moving toward the stage with grim purpose. Beside him, Beatrice Sterling saw the emails. She saw the proof of the embezzlement and the hostile takeover plot. The shame was too much for her fragile social standing. She let out a strangled cry, her hand clutching her chest, and slumped sideways in a dead faint. Her emerald hat rolled across the grass, but no one moved to help her. All eyes were fixed on the stage. I stood alone in the center of the chaos, a solitary figure in white silk. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply watched. I watched Julian screaming at the locked door, looking over his shoulder with the wild eyes of a trapped animal. I watched the realization hit him that there was no way out. He was not the predator anymore. He was the prey, and I had just sprung the trap. The manicured lawn of Grand Oak Manor transformed instantly from a wedding venue into a chaotic trading floor. The silence was replaced by the frantic murmur of hundreds of voice calls as the most powerful people in the city scrambled to cut ties. I watched as the CEO of a major investment bank, a man Julian had courted for months, shouted into his phone to sell his entire position in Sterling Global immediately. The stock ticker on the giant screen behind me was no longer necessary. The panic in the crowd told the story. Julian's net worth was evaporating by the millions with every passing second, fueled by the live stream that was currently trending #1 globally. Julian turned away from the locked control booth, his face pale and slick with sweat. He scanned the crowd and saw his allies fleeing. Desperation clawed at his throat. He spun around and ran toward me, stumbling slightly in his haste. He dropped to his knees at the hem of my dress, grabbing my hand with a grip that felt clammy and terrified. "Elena, please," he begged, his voice pitching up into a pathetic whine. "You have to listen to me. It is not what it looks like. I was trapped. It was her." He jabbed a finger back toward Mia. "She is crazy. Elena. She drugged me. She blackmailed me into this. I never wanted the money or the babies. I only wanted you." The lie was so audacious it almost commanded respect, but it was the match that ignited the powder keg. Mia, who had been paralyzed by shock, suddenly snapped back to reality. The color rushed into her cheeks, violent and red. She let out a scream that sounded more animal than human. "You liar," Mia shrieked. She stormed up the stairs of the altar, ignoring the gasp of the remaining crowd. She looked deranged, her perfect hair coming loose, her eyes wide with fury. "You trapped me. You told me Elena was just a frigid cash cow. You told me you hated touching her." She turned to the audience, waving her arms frantically. "He is the mastermind. I have the recordings. He made me set up the shell companies. He told me exactly how to structure the fake invoices to drain the wedding fund." They stood there on the altar, the groom and the maid of honor, tearing each other apart like rabid dogs. It was a verbal brawl that stripped away every layer of their carefully constructed social masks. Julian called her a delusional stalker. Mia screamed that he was a sociopathic narcissist. They hurled insults about their intimate life, their crimes, and their greed, broadcasting their own guilt louder than any prosecutor could hope for. I lifted the microphone to my lips one last time. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to their hysteria. "You can save your breath," I said, my words booming over their argument. "It does not matter who blames whom." At 8 o'clock this morning, I sent a complete digital dossier to the district attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every email, every bank transfer, and every recording is already on the desk of a federal prosecutor, as if I had summoned them. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. It started as a low hum and quickly grew into a deafening roar that tore through the tranquil atmosphere of the estate. Blue and red lights began to flash through the trees lining the long driveway, growing brighter with every second. Julian froze mid-shout. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He looked at the flashing lights, then at the fleeing guests, and finally at me. He realized then that there was no talking his way out of this. He had lost the company. He had lost the money. He had lost his freedom. His expression shifted from pathetic begging to pure, unadulterated malice. His face twisted into a snarl. "You bitch!" he spat, lunging at me with his hands outstretched, aiming for my throat. "I will kill you for this. I did not even flinch. I did not have to." Before he could take 2 steps, my father's head of security moved in. He tackled Julian with the force of a linebacker, slamming the groom face first onto the white carpet. A collective gasp went up from the few stragglers as Julian was pinned down, his arm wrenched behind his back, his face pressed into the dirt. The guests who had lingered to watch the drama now scrambled for the exits, hiking up their expensive gowns and running toward the valet, terrified of being questioned as accomplices. The venue emptied as if the plague had arrived. Mia did not run. She looked at Julian, who was groaning in pain on the floor, and then she looked at the police cars screeching to a halt at the entrance. She realized she was not the victorious mistress who would inherit the empire. She was a co-conspirator with no money, no job, and 2 children on the way who would be born in prison. She collapsed onto the floor, her legs giving out, and buried her face in her hands, sobbing with the gut-wrenching sound of a woman who knew her life was effectively over. The illusion of a fairy tale wedding dissolved completely the moment the heavy oak gates of the estate were thrown open by force. A squad of uniformed officers flooded the garden, their dark blue uniforms creating a stark, jarring contrast against the sea of white florals and pastel silks. They moved with the efficiency of a team that had been briefed hours ago, cutting through the confusion to encircle the altar. The lead detective, a man with a face carved from granite, marched straight up to Julian. My fiancé was still pinned to the ground by my security team, dirt smudging his pristine tuxedo. The detective signaled for my guards to step back, and then he hauled Julian to his feet. "Julian Sterling," the detective announced, his voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. "You are under arrest for 18 counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." The metallic click of the handcuffs securing his wrists behind his back was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was louder than the wedding bells would have been. Julian looked down at the steel cuffs in disbelief. He was wearing a suit that cost $5,000, and now he was being treated like a common criminal. Around us, the few guests who had not yet fled and the swarm of reporters raised their phones. The image of the golden boy of the business world, shackled at his own wedding, was uploaded instantly to the internet. It was the kind of image that ended careers and destroyed legacies in a matter of seconds. The officers did not stop with the groom. 2 female officers approached Mia, who was still sobbing on the floor. She looked up, mascara streaming down her face, expecting sympathy. Instead, she was met with a badge. "Mia Davis. You are being detained for questioning regarding the receipt of stolen funds and aiding and abetting financial fraud," one officer stated coldly. Mia screamed as they pulled her up. "I cannot go to jail. I am pregnant. You cannot touch me." "We have a medical team on standby at the precinct," the officer replied, unmoved. As she guided Mia forcefully toward the waiting patrol cars, I stood tall on the raised platform of the altar, looking down at the wreckage of their lives. I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding dress and pulled out a silver USB drive. I walked down the stairs, the long train of my gown trailing behind me like a royal cape, and approached the lead detective. "This drive contains the original files, the unedited audio recordings, and the forensic accounting trail," I said, my voice steady. "It proves that every dollar they spent on their lifestyle was stolen from the Vance Family Trust and the Charitable Foundation." The detective took the drive and nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Ms. Vance. We will take it from here." My father stepped up beside me, placing a protective arm around my shoulders. He looked at the press pool, his eyes blazing. "Let it be known that Vance Enterprises is severing all ties with the Sterling family effective immediately. We are filing a civil suit for the recovery of $2 million in embezzled funds, and we will not rest until they are left with nothing." As the police dragged Julian toward the exit, he seemed to snap out of his shock. He twisted his head back, his eyes locking onto mine. "Elena," he screamed, his voice raw and desperate. "Elena, stop this. I can explain. Do not do this to me." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I did not turn around. I simply watched a butterfly land on a white rose, completely indifferent to his existence. Beatrice Sterling, who had regained consciousness, saw her son being shoved into the back of a squad car. She let out a wail of pure agony and tried to run after them. In her haste, she tripped over the hem of her emerald gown and fell hard onto the gravel path. She scrambled on her hands and knees, reaching out toward the departing vehicle, a pathetic figure of a fallen matriarch. The cameras captured that too, the final, humiliating collapse of the Sterling dynasty. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from my legal team. They had just released a prepared statement to the major news outlets. It framed the narrative perfectly. I was not the scorned woman. I was the whistleblower. I was the strong, ethical victim who had discovered corruption and chosen justice over personal happiness. The public opinion was already swaying in my favor. As the police cars drove away, a second wave of vehicles arrived. These were not law enforcement, but creditors. My lawyers had tipped them off. Men in windbreakers moved in, carrying clipboards. One of them approached Mia, who was being held by the police car, and pointed to the diamond earrings she was wearing. That jewelry is listed as assets purchased with the proceeds of crime, the agent said. We are seizing it as evidence and collateral. Mia shrieked as she was forced to unclasp the jewelry I had unknowingly paid for. The garden, which was supposed to be a sanctuary of love, was now a crime scene. Yellow police tape was being strung up between the oak trees. The white roses that lined the aisle were trampled into the mud by combat boots. Silk ribbons were torn and fluttering in the wind. I looked at the destruction and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It was ugly, it was messy, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The cacophony of the sirens faded into the distance, taking the circus of my ruined wedding with it. Silence returned to Grand Oak Manor, but it was no longer the tense, expectant silence of a ceremony about to begin. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a battlefield after the fighting has finally stopped. I stood alone in the middle of the debris. I reached up and unpinned the heavy lace veil that had been fastened to my hair for hours. It felt suffocating, a web spun to trap a fly. I pulled it free and let it drop to the floor, watching it settle among the trampled rose petals and mud like a discarded ghost of the bride I was supposed to be. I walked over to a high cocktail table where a waiter had abandoned a tray of drinks during the commotion. The crystal flutes were still full, the golden bubbles rising in steady streams. I picked one up. The glass was cool against my palm, grounding me. I raised it to the empty garden, to the overturned chairs, and to the phantom of the life I had almost trapped myself in. Cheers to you. Elena, I whispered to the wind. You saved your own life. I drank the champagne in one long swallow. It tasted crisp and clean, washing away the bitter taste of betrayal that had coated my tongue for a week. I surveyed the venue one last time. The thousands of dollars of imported orchids, the silk ribbons, the custom lighting, it all looked so cheap now. It was a stage set for a play that had been canceled on opening night. My gaze fell on my left hand. The 3-carat diamond engagement ring sat heavy on my finger. For months, I had looked at it as a symbol of Julian's love, a promise of forever. Now, I knew it was just another asset purchased with money he had siphoned from my family accounts. It was not a gift, it was a prop used to manipulate me. I slid it off my finger. The metal felt cold as it left my skin. I walked back to the altar and placed the ring on the wooden podium where the vows were supposed to have been read. I left it there, a shiny, worthless token for the cleaning crew to find. A strange sensation washed over me. I waited for the tears. I waited for the crushing weight of heartbreak to bring me to my knees. But it never came. Instead, I felt an overwhelming lightness. My chest expanded, taking in a deep breath of air that did not smell of Julian's expensive cologne or Mia's cloying perfume. It smelled of grass and earth and freedom. I was not a victim. I was a survivor who had cut the infection out before it could kill me. My phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from the private investigator. He had sent a screenshot of the financial news. Julian Sterling, arrested at Alter, headed the bulletin. The text below confirmed that trading on Sterling Global had been suspended by the Securities and Exchange Commission after the stock value plummeted 90% in 20 minutes. The empire was dead. I typed a simple reply. Thank you for everything. Send the bill to my father. Then, I pressed and held the power button. I watched the screen fade to black. I did not want to hear the apologies from friends who had ignored the red flags. I did not want to see the fake sympathy on social media. I was done with the digital noise. I turned my back on the altar and began to walk down the aisle. I walked alone, my head held high, my train gliding over the ruined grass. I stepped out of the garden and onto the driveway. The gloom that had threatened the sky all morning had broken. The midday sun was blazing down, bright and unforgiving, bleaching out the shadows. A sleek black town car was idling at the curb. It was not the vintage Rolls-Royce meant for the bride and groom. It was my personal car, packed with the luggage I had secretly prepared 3 days ago. The driver, a loyal employee who had been with my family since I was a child, stepped out and opened the door. He looked at me with concern, scanning my face for signs of a breakdown. Where to? Ms. Vance, he asked softly. Back to the penthouse, I paused, looking back at the mansion one last time. I thought of the Maldives, the honeymoon suite booked under Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. That trip was for a dead woman. No, I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in months. Take me to the airport. I have a first-class ticket to Tokyo that leaves in 3 hours. I sat in the exclusive stillness of the first-class lounge at JFK International Airport, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The wall of televisions opposite me was flashing breaking news banners in urgent red. The sound was muted, but the captions screamed the truth loud enough for everyone to see. Julian Sterling and Mia Davis were currently being interrogated at the federal building. The ticker at the bottom of the screen revealed the scope of what I had unleashed. It was not just about my wedding fund anymore. In their desperate bid to save their own skins, the two of them had started implicating a dozen corrupt city officials and offshore bankers in a massive money laundering scheme. My personal vendetta had inadvertently pulled the thread that unraveled an entire tapestry of white-collar crime. The news anchors were calling me a whistleblower, a woman of integrity who stood up against corruption. It was ironic because I did not set out to clean up the city. I just wanted to burn down the house of the man who betrayed me. However, if being a hero was the side effect of my vengeance, I was willing to accept the title. My burner phone, the one I had bought solely for this escape, vibrated on the marble table. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ms. Vance, a clipped, nervous voice said, "This is Arthur Pym, representing Mr. Sterling. My client is prepared to offer a full restitution of the $2 million he misappropriated, plus interest. If you agree to sign a non-prosecution affidavit, he wants to settle this quietly." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled a businessman sitting nearby. "Listen carefully, Mr. Pym," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Tell your client that he can keep the money. Consider it my charity donation to the 2 innocent children who are unfortunate enough to have him as a father. They will need every cent of it when they grow up with a felon for a dad. I do not want his money. I want to see him in an orange jumpsuit. I want justice, not a refund." I did not wait for a response. I ended the call. With calm precision, I popped the back of the phone open, removed the SIM card, and snapped it in half. I walked over to the recycling bin and dropped the pieces inside. That was it. The last tether to Julian, to the drama, and to the pain was severed. The overhead announcement chimed, calling for the final boarding of Flight 802 to Tokyo. I picked up my bag and walked toward the gate. With every step, I felt lighter. The title of Julian Sterling's fiancée was left behind at the check-in counter, dissolving like mist. I thought back to that cream-colored envelope I had found on his desk just 24 hours ago. That baby shower invitation had been a weapon that shattered my heart. But now, it was just Exhibit A in a federal case. It marked the death of the naive girl who believed in fairy tales and the birth of a woman who knew the value of cold, hard truth. Settled into my seat, I looked out the window as the plane taxied down the runway. The engines roared to life, pushing us into the sky. I watched New York City shrink beneath me. The skyscrapers looked like toys, and the streets where I had fallen in love and had my heart broken became insignificant grid lines. I reached into my carry-on and pulled out my leather-bound planner. On the first page, written in excited cursive, was the header wedding plan. I uncapped my pen and drew a thick, black line through it. Underneath, in bold, block letters, I wrote a new title plan for the rebirth of the Vance Empire. The plane punched through the layer of gray clouds and burst into the dazzling golden light of the upper atmosphere. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, finally allowing myself to rest. Tomorrow morning, Julian would wake up on a metal cot in a holding cell, facing a lifetime of regret. I would wake up in Tokyo, on the other side of the world, completely free and stronger than I had ever been. This was not just an ending. It was a magnificent beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help these stories reach even more listeners.